to make sure they're working.
Hello, hello. We're going to get started. We were working out a live stream. I think it worked. So welcome. This is Alvi. I need you all to give Alvi a hand because Alvi was just like sweating it out, getting this live stream working. And if you wouldn't mind, just make sure their mics work once I introduce. So hi, everyone. I'm really, really glad to see you all. This feels like an important day here with everything that's been going on since this morning. And so I'm here, I'm Julie Carr. I'm a professor in the English department and chair of Women and Gender Studies. And I'm here to introduce Professors Karen Cox and Ashley Lawrence Sanders. So the format for today's event is as follows. After a short introduction, Karen and Ashley will each speak for around 5 minutes about their research, kind of giving you an overview of what they do. And then they're going to essentially interview each other. They're going to have a conversation with each other. Their research very much overlaps and informs one another. And I think it'll be great to hear them talking to each other. And then after about half an hour, 40 minutes of that, we'll feel it out. We'll open it up to questions from you all, and we'll have a larger conversation. One thing about the event is that this library closes at 6. And so I think the first time we're going to get interrupted is going to be at 5:30, and it'll be very annoying and loud and but you know, we'll be okay. And then it'll happen again. I think hopefully only 15 minutes later, not like every 5. So what I'm hoping is that we will be done definitely at 5:45 so that we can not get locked into the building. Okay. Both of these scholars do research into Confederate and neo-Confederate memory and myth making, especially as it's been expressed and extended through the construction of hundreds of monuments to the Confederacy throughout the South. And they will discuss also the 150 years of resistance to these monuments and all that they represent. It's been just over 5 years since the deadly Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville. And while that event is in no way the only significant scene of confrontation between the extremes of the far right supremacist movements and those who have long resisted them, it is a touchstone for this country for how it brought that struggle to the front of many people's awareness. Dr. Cox and Lawrence Sanders have both done significant research into the history of both sides of that confrontation, and both are interested in how symbolism, flags, monuments, and other images are at the heart of the neo-Confederate movement, just as they are at the heart of other fascist groups and movements in the past and in our time. So if we're to successfully continue to resist the spread of fascist ideologies here in the US and elsewhere, we need to understand the important role that visual culture, public space, and popular culture play in the dissemination of these ideas. As Dr. Lawrence Sanders has written, popular culture is, quote, another aspect of public space, and both arenas are fruitful for understanding how group or collective identities, and in this case, racial and ideological identities, are reinforced. Or as Dr. Cox has written, Confederate monuments are not innocuous symbols, though in the past they were used by white Southerners to teach about mythological, noble heritage, completely stripped of the story of slavery. What they teach is not history. They are weapons in the larger arsenal of white supremacy. So I want to extend my thanks to the President's Fund for the Humanities and to the Center for the Humanities and Arts and to the Departments of English, History, and Geography for helping to fund this event, which is the third in a series of events organized by the April Institute for Anti-Fascist Research and Education. So a word about that. So we are a nonprofit independent organization for interdisciplinary research and public education about fascism and anti-fascism in the United States. We celebrate the history of creative and courageous efforts to counter fascist threats and to build more resilient, safe, and democratic communities. In addition to panels like today's, we're working on a number of public-facing projects, which we hope to roll out in the coming year. And there will also be another panel run by the April Institute in March on the Hands Off Ethiopia African-American-led movement that responded to Mussolini's invasion of Ethiopia. So that's coming up. And you can follow us on Twitter, or you can also look at our website, which is aprilinstitute.org. So just one word about the term fascism in the title of this event. While some will argue, and maybe I'm speaking to the choir, so forgive me, but I'm going to say it anyway. Some will argue that this term is only applicable to the fascist movements in Italy and Germany in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. We are working with a more capacious definition. To quote the historian of anti-fascism, Christopher Viles, fascism is a far-right political movement that seeks to, quote, destroy democratic space and violently harden social hierarchies through a militaristic, often anti-Marxist, racist, symbol-laden cultural project of national rebirth. So there's many aspects of American history and of its political and social life that reflect this ideology. And it's the April Institute's mission to draw attention to these tendencies and even more to highlight the long and ongoing struggle to resist them. So I will now read you the bios of our incredible conversationalists, and then we will move in. So Ashley Lawrence Sanders is an assistant professor in the history department at the University of Colorado Boulder, right here, where she teaches courses on African-American history and US history. Her research encompasses Civil War memory, Black Southern history, Black radicalism, and public memory in the United States. Her work has been featured in the Journal of African American History, the Washington Post, Black Perspectives, NPR, and she has appeared on Al Jazeera and Colorado Public Radio and the BBC World News. She's currently working on her first book project, They Knew What the War Was About, African Americans and the Memory of the Civil War, which explores Black Americans' long engagement with the memory and meaning of the Civil War and the myths of the lost cause. Karen L. Cox is a professor of history at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, an award-winning historian and a distinguished lecturer for the Organization of American Historians. She's the author of 4 books, the editor or co-editor of 2 volumes on Southern history, and has written numerous essays and articles. Her books include Dixie's Daughters, The United Daughters of the Confederacy and the Preservation of Confederate Culture, Dreaming of Dixie, How the South Was Created in American Popular Culture, and most recently, No Common Ground, Confederate Monuments and the Ongoing Fight for Racial Justice. Dr. Cox has also a very robust practice as a public scholar and has written op-eds for most of the major national news venues. She's given dozens of media interviews in the US and around the world and has appeared in several documentaries, including Henry Louis Gates's PBS documentary, Reconstruction America After the Civil War, and the Emmy-nominated documentary, The Neutral Ground, which examines the underlying history of Confederate monuments. Her current book explores explores the Rhythm Club fire, which took the lives of more than 200 African Americans in Natchez, Mississippi in 1940, and was the deadliest club fire in the history of the United States when it happened. Thank you, and help me to welcome Ashley and Karen, and if you could help with the mics before we begin. Thank you.
So I want to say thank you for inviting me here to come first visit to your campus.
very impressed that this is a turnout of this magnitude. I will call it this magnitude on a Friday afternoon. As she told you, I think, I'm probably well known now, I guess, for writing about the issue of Confederate monuments. And it's something that it's part of all of my work is really cultural history of the South. And I started, and I wrote about Confederate monuments a long time ago. It was in my dissertation. It was in the first book I wrote on the United Daughters of the Confederacy. And it was just this one chapter that I wrote. And I think that for me, and I know probably for Ashley as well, it was the Charleston massacre in Mother Emanuel Church that really, I think, really brought this movement, into the open. This desire to hold on to Confederate memory, but also turn it into something really violent. And so in the summer of 2015, I probably wrote, I would say it was my first op-ed on this subject matter, and it was for the Huffington Post. And I don't even know if anybody reads that anymore. But I wanted to write something because I felt like, there were things that were being missed in the discussion about what had happened in Charleston. And one of the things I said, even though the focus was very much on the Confederate battle flag, they didn't talk about the fact that there were Confederate monuments on the grounds of the state capitol, for example, in South Carolina. And so even when they removed the flag, the monuments are still there. They're still there now. And so and in that piece, I said, Confederate monuments don't belong on the grounds of government. I said, we should not be subsidizing Confederate monuments and their upkeep in any kind of public spaces like that, especially spaces that I feel are meant to be democratic spaces for all citizens of a state or even within a county. And so that's where I got started and really sort of the trajectory of my scholarship, because I really started writing these op-eds. And then I wrote the op-eds following the Unite the Right rally, because I was watching that unfold on Twitter. Does anybody go to that anymore? No, I'm kidding. I still do. I was watching that unfold and I thought, I know what this is about, and I wanted to say something about it. And so I spoke with the editor that I'd worked with at the time at the New York Times, and I wrote a piece. And while I was in the middle of writing that, the Washington Post asked me to write a piece. I had to write, and they had to be really different. So the thing about writing op-eds is you're under the gun and get it out in about 24 to 36 hours. It's really quick because the news cycle, goes through so fast. So I was talking to Dr. Ballou earlier about this, and I said, it's a very heavy topic that we write about, both she and I. And at the same time, and sometimes it feels like a burden, but it's a burden I'm willing to carry. And I think she feels the same way. It's a burden that we carry because we feel like it's important to educate people about this topic. And I'll just say one final thing. And I want to talk about our Southern backgrounds at some point in this, because I think we should talk about why it's important that we as Southerners are writing about it. So maybe I'll save that and let you go ahead and go.
Yeah. Thank you so much to everyone to organizing this. I'm very happy to be here with Karen. I think we've sort of known each other virtually for a while. And as every sort of iteration of, monument discussion has been happening over the last several years, Karen has been very gracious to be able to, contact me and say, oh, so-and-so wants to talk to me. I pass them on to you. After a while, they say that you should talk to this historian about this subject, instead, et cetera. And I really appreciate, historians who do that, as someone whose work that I really read and respected a lot when I was in graduate school working on my own dissertation. It inspired me. So I'm very happy to be in conversation here with her. And as, part of my own work, just kind of reading about memory and really be interested in memory even before I went into graduate school, and then reading a lot about Civil War memory, and then thinking, wow, there still is not enough about Black people in Civil War memory. reading David Blight's Race and Reunion and, you know, loving Race and Reunion, right? But also thinking there was so much more to be said about how Black people thought about the war, how Black people experienced the war, how Black people continue to fight against the lost cause in these many different eras, you know, where there were just sort of a lot of gaps that really inspired me to think through, like, you know, yeah, I want to write more about the sort of longer history of like Black engagement, and also sort of this sort of internally important memory of the war for Black people. Like, yes, there was this confrontation all the time, right? But there was also this, what does the war mean to African Americans, which is its own distinct thing, is what I tell people, right? Very much centered on a narrative around self-emancipation, et cetera, right? So that really sort of inspired me to get started with this research. And it's sort of been, you know, literally deciding on this topic, and then boom, everything kind of happens in graduate school on the Emanuel AME massacre. You know, that happens. Then the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville happens. So then the topic, every time I would say, well, I guess we won't be talking about this in another. I literally said this at a panel, and I was sitting in a panel in Princeton when they were discussing taking Woodrow Wilson's name off of the school there. And then the decision immediately was no, right? They had decided already before we sat down for the panel, they were not going to do it, which of course, you know, now that name is gone, right? Shows you how quickly things changed and the dynamics of like memory and naming, et cetera. But I remember saying on that panel, I was like, well, I don't know how much longer we're going to be having this conversation about monuments, because I legitimately thought that we would be moving on from this conversation as soon as people wanted to move on from it. But it still continued on, right? And at times that's made the work a little bit more difficult, to be frank. You know, just thinking about how it actually has the real world implications of what's going on. At times it's invigorated me, you know, to actually illuminate some of the more historical sort of battles that are often like difficult and radical and tough, right? The battles that African Americans have waged, and seeing the importance of memory and, you know, memory as, you know, sort of a tangible thing. But, you know, and now we are still here, you know, and this is still a topic of, you know, important conversation. The expanded nature of what sort of this memory means, you know, there's a symbolism, of course, you know, which we'll, you know, talk about quite a bit, the monuments, the flags, the songs, you know, Dixie, et cetera. But also this battle, which, you know, I think Karen writes so eloquently about, especially in Dixie's Daughter, is about history, right? And the battles over history and how it influences children is the real battle, right? For the UDC, like this is the most important thing to them in many ways, is how they can influence this next generation and how we see the continuities of this continuing on throughout sort of these generations. So, and I see that a lot in my own work, because I see how African Americans are realizing how this is impacting the way Black children are taught, right? They have to read these same lost cause textbooks, right? In these Black Southern schools. And some teachers are refusing to teach these, you know, teach these lessons. And so like, you know, I'm seeing like how like the difficulty of being against the type of structure where you have a government structure, right, that is basically ceding control over curriculum, et cetera, to these forces, and how it does impact like sort of marginalized communities' desires to actually take control of their own history as well, right? So like we have this sort of parallel movement of the Black history movement at the same time, and how those things are really, you know, focused on this element of like how much memory is influencing all of this. So that goes into a lot of my own work as well. And yeah, and I'm hoping that, you know, we can talk a little bit more about how we see this longer trajectory manifesting itself in some really dangerous ways. How people have often thought about Southern heritage movements as being sort of benign in many ways for me. I think for much of my youth, as being sort of like just a thing that people do. And I think people kind of got woken up to how dangerous it was maybe in 2015 and 2017 in some ways. So, yeah.
I agree, because when I was writing the last chapter of No Common Ground, George Floyd was murdered, and I thought I was about to end the book, but there was no ending the book. I had to write about that moment, right? And I said, every time I think it's, you know, it's calmed down, it comes roaring back in some form or fashion. I would have never anticipated this. And people ask, you know, it's like how, and I think it is for students too. It's like, how does the murder of a Black man in Minneapolis inspire people to go out and then and basically protest Confederate monuments in Richmond, Virginia, which is what happened. And I said, you know, it's because they see in these symbols their own oppression. And it's about police brutality. It's about white supremacy. It's about systemic racism and all those things. And in some ways, then that giant Robert E. Lee monument, that statuary that was on Monument Avenue, became, you know, sort of this canvas for protesters to be able to express their feelings about that. It wasn't just that one; they were all down the row. If you, you know, I don't know any of you been to Richmond, but it's these things are enormous. And so I just, at this point, I'm like, I'm never going to say it's never coming back, because it's going to, I mean, we're still talking about it, we're having this conversation, but I don't know that it won't explode on us again. And, you know, so I think that's why we are still talking, because it's like, anytime you think it's gone, it's not gone. It's still there. I wanted to ask you, actually, I wanted to think about, you know, those kind of early textbooks kind of thing, because there's this through line between all these discussions that were and these protests that are going on with school boards and school systems around the country over CRT or over just teaching African-American studies. That goes all, you know, there's a through line that goes back, at least as far as I know, as the United Daughters of the Confederacy, who were, you know, a lot of people will say in the South, they'll say, you know, that are very much Confederate heritage buffs, that you know, that that's all it is. It's just about heritage. And, you know, it's, you know, and the UDC are just a bunch of old ladies that were focused on just honoring, you know, the men and their families. But the United Daughters of the Confederacy in the early 20th century was a relatively young group of women. I say they were under the age of 50, not over the age of 50. And, and the UDC was very much I say, yeah, their focus was not on the past. Their focus was on the future and the future of the South. And so whether it's a monument, whether it's a textbook or whatever other kinds of things that they were, you know, involved in, it was about looking toward a future South that would still respect and maintain the values of the Confederacy as they understood them. And also the values of white supremacy, to be frank, because when they would unveil those monuments in the early 20th century, there was always, you know, some speaker there. And it's very telling if you just read the speeches of the unveilings, and they're telling you exactly what they think these monuments are about. Very often it's about white supremacy. And it's not that, and it's also this, it's not that only that they built a monument. They didn't just build monuments and then walk away and it just stood there. Every year on Confederate Memorial Day, they would come back and there would be rituals around it. And children were always involved in the rituals. And they were making sure the children were learning the lessons of the lost cause in the classroom. And then you fast forward another generation or two, and then it's like, you know, about anti-communism, which is really about being against civil rights. And how can we get that kind of stuff in textbooks? And I think there was, in the 70s, up until the 70s, that kind of lost cause stuff about the Confederacy, or that Reconstruction was a tragic era, was still in Southern textbooks. Mm-hmm. And now we're just seeing it come back. Mm-hmm. So I was thinking too, like, and I'd like to hear what you have to say about, because, you know, because Black public schools got the cast off books from white public schools, she's right, they were reading the same material. Mm-hmm. How did they resist that?
Well, I know from, Heather Williams's excellent book, Self-Taught, which covers Black education during slavery and also during Reconstruction, that we do know that often that Black teachers were often actively resisting, right? Some of the textbooks that they would see, like really read, that would awfully say some awful racist, like really directly racist things. We know that there were organizational efforts, right? By the time we get to the 20th century, like NAACP has all these sort of reports around like textbooks all the way up to like New York City, right? Like I include this in my book about how like New York, they do like a textbook analysis of New York City textbooks and how it covers Civil War and Reconstruction, right? And they're like, oh, well, they don't give any credit to Black people. I was actually fighting in the war, and they talk about Reconstruction in this way, right? Like they're actually doing this sort of analysis. And there's usually mostly in urban areas, it does not make it to like Black Southern schools, but in urban areas and, in the South and maybe like in the West, Midwest and Northeast, we do get Black textbooks, right? By like the 19-teens, 1920s, usually Black educators, usually Black women educators are writing many of these textbooks themselves. They're teachers, K-12 teachers often, and they're writing very Black-centered accounts of history, Black-centered accounts of the Civil War and Reconstruction. That center Black participation and, Black revolt and rebellion and resistance, and et cetera. But that's not very widespread, right? It's very much localized in the sense that, if there's a teacher in DC that, the book will be popular in DC because she's a well-known teacher in DC and she gets enough people to like, be able to print this book and publish it in DC. But it's so localized, right? Like, so if you're like the mass majority of Black children who are still in the South, you're still being, operating. The best that can probably happen is sort of Black community history education, right? Which is, traditionally, unfortunately, how Black history is often taught. So which is what I always tell my students, is that like the history of teaching Black history often did not happen in the academy or in K through 12. It was often through community programs like churches, like, different sort of ASALH-led programs, Association for the Study of African American Life and History, chapter programs that were designed around like community pageants during Black History Month, like these kinds of things that were also very much geared towards children, because in the same way that the UDC knew that children were going to be this next generation, people like Carter G. Woodson were developing things like the Negro History Bulletin that could go to, Black teachers to have specific activities that would be, amenable to teach Black children Black history, right? They don't have the same, budget, right? The same, but they want like to be able to actually have that same kind of spread. So much of this is outside of the school system. So as much as kids are learning that history, it is not through the full sort of formal textbooks or anything. But they know that this history, they know that history is wrong and bad. Like they know that they're not getting the right history. The teachers know it. They're not refusing to teach their children that, Reconstruction was a failure because of Negro rule, right? Or that Black people, didn't participate or add anything to the Civil War, or, that like, slavery was a benign institution and slaves were pretty much happy. Like they were refusing to do this. But then I do get this anecdotal stories of like, Black people being like compelled in the South because it was like district policy to sing Dixie. Like it was like the policy of like whatever for children to sing Dixie, even in like segregated schools. So you see how like much, the lost cause still works through these different places. And it has such a spread nationally. I mean, you just, I mentioned New York City, but it does have such a spread nationally. And like, I've talked to many people and they've grown up many different places and they're like, well, I was always taught that the Civil War was about states' rights. And they'll be from like Illinois, right? Like when they're not from South Carolina, they're from Illinois. That was the success of the lost cause, right? That spreading.
I assume everybody knows what the lost cause is in this room. But it is this mythological narrative, right? And within this big mythology are these other myths about Reconstruction, about Negro rule, about, slavery as an institution, and Reconstruction as the tragic era. I mean, it goes on and it goes on and on. And, among historians who write about this, we say, yes, the North won the war, but the South won the peace. And they won the peace because they took control of the narrative. And the narrative becomes, widespread. It's not limited to the South, as you
Yeah.
say. And it also emerges in popular culture, especially in the 20th century. It's in all sorts of things. It's like there are Birth of a Nation, for example, is a Hollywood film. It was written by a Southerner. The book itself was, but this becomes this widespread and shared, with the American public. And then it goes all the way up, I wrote about this in a different book, but if you go all the way up to Gone with the Wind, for example, which is the ultimate lost cause film of that period. That is total lost cause on film. And it's expressed in just the first few minutes of the film with the mammy figure, with the Southern, lady, with the big white house, the big mansion, the slaves working in the cotton fields. It's like this, image of that. But that wasn't just something that Southerners bought into, right? It was actually a worldwide phenomenon. And so such that, people were traveling to Georgia to try to find Margaret Mitchell. And there were people who were like hucksters living around Atlanta that would offer to give people tours and take them to see Tara, which of course was a fictional place. But it just gets the extent to which people buy into the lost cause, and people still buy into it. I think you hear it in the language of politicians. When they talk, they'll tell you that the Civil War was not about slavery; it was about states' rights. You hear that now.
Mm-hmm.
You hear it now because it never went away. And I honest to God don't know how you defeat 150 years of a narrative that's strong. I mean, we're doing our best as historians. We're out there fighting the good fight, but it so dominates things.
Yeah, and I think, and I kind of want to hear your opinion on this too, because I think there was something about, in 2015, what happens at the Manuel massacre, I think was sort of, easily in some ways put to the side, like, oh, this is like a distinctly Southern thing. He's a Southerner or whatever. I mean, we could maybe ignore the fact that he had all these other flags too, right? A Rhodesian flag, like these are flags that are known as definite white nationalist symbols, right? Like, so there was the Confederate flag was part of this pantheon. He's spouting a replacement theory, right? Like these are things that we now know are common in all of these events as well. So now we recognize the patterns, but at the time it was like, oh, he's a Southerner, he did Southern racist things, but whatever. But then when we get to the Unite the Right rally, and then we have all these groups of people coming from all over the country and maybe even Canada to Charlottesville, and then now people are kind of exposed to, oh, wow, there are all these people coalescing around a thing we thought was Southern, right? And wanting to protect it. What does this mean for how we understand the role of sort of neo-Confederacy or Confederate symbols in beyond the region of the South? And so people were discussing it as a new thing, right? Like there's a new thing that people are just tapping into this symbolism as a new thing. And of course, we know that it's a new thing. And I'm curious about what you think about that, the levels of violence of these sort of quote unquote alt-right, whatever, domestic terror groups that are coalescing around this symbolism, how it's not a new thing, right? How we get to this point, but why people may not know the longer history of how much Confederate symbolism has been easily a part of national sort of right-wing terror.
There's people out there doing work on this. It's know more about this than I do, but the ways in which even, during the civil rights movement, let's just give an example. I have these photographs I show, of when I'm doing a presentation, and they're both from the same period, from the 60s. And there's Confederate battle flags in both, and they're both at diners. Mm-hmm. And one of them is in Little Rock, Arkansas. I mean, they got the slick back hair of the 50s, the guys pompadours and stuff. The other was from the Bronx, New York. And in 63, I think it was, there was, whites were trying to keep blacks out of the White Castle. restaurant. And so they showed up, but when they showed up to protest that, I mean, I think the Congress of Racial Equality was, first of all, was protesting, but when these, sort of counter protesters come, all these white people from the community who are not Southerners at all, but they were like waving Confederate battle flags, wearing little hats with the battle flag on them, was on, yeah, I mean, so people adopt those symbols generally as a form of protest against, I don't know, these efforts of racial justice. It's usually emerges in those settings. And so, that was one that I remember pretty clearly. And so, the thing about the Unite the Right rally is that you would be hard pressed to find, a lot of Southerners in that, like white Southerners who have actual Confederate heritage, because they say we're going to go because they want to defend the Robert E. Lee Monument in Charlottesville from possibly being removed. And that's not why they were there at all. They were there. It was like and I often say it's like even white supremacists know that the Confederate monument is a white supremacist symbol. That's why they chose it. And so, I'm primarily, study more of the stuff around the Confederacy and everything, but it's always, the battle flag, there's like the two main symbols are really the monuments and the flags. Of course, around the South, there are also, school names, street names, names of parks, and, all sorts of things that are named for former Confederates, either the national leaders or the, maybe local heroes themselves. But it's the flag probably more than anything, because it's mobile. You can't stop it from being, you can't stop a battle flag. You can't, prevent it from being produced. You can't, people can take them with them anywhere. And, and that's what people will do. They'll show up to intimidate racial minorities or whatever in using these particular symbols, because they understand it as a symbol against racial justice. It's like, we're going to stand it. It's a symbol of white supremacy and also meant to intimidate. And so, when the Meredith March happened, that was the thing that they did when they were marching. Was a James Meredith who integrated Ole Miss, and he wants to test out the Voting Rights Act, right? And he's going to come through the Delta of Mississippi and try to register voters. And the people who get together say, let's all show up and have our, and bring your Confederate battle flags with you. That symbol is still being used. It's interesting to me to note also, I noticed probably in the last 10 years or so, it's not the battle flag that's being used. It's the first flag of the national flag of the Confederacy, because people don't know what it is unless you know what it is. Because there were several Confederate flags. The battle flag is the one that everybody sees. But it's this first national flag that they start to use. It's like, it's like somebody, you know what the Gadsden flag is, right? It's like, you don't know unless you know. And so, I don't know if I've really answered your question there, but I think about these really are tools of intimidation and tools of white supremacy meant to intimidate and put a stop to equality or movements for equality and justice.
No, I mean, I think that's true. I mean, I think you talked about the hats and stuff in New York, and like, I write quite a bit about the flag fad in the 1950s, where they're selling it in Saks Fifth Avenue and Woolworths, and all the department stores are selling flags. They're like, get your Confederate flags. It's just like the thing to do. You see all these ads, and you see primarily like Black radical groups being like, wait a second, why are we selling, Confederate flags? They do the boycotts at a bunch of the stores, they get the unions involved. And then you get like, the Black communists, they're the ones that are saying that it's fascist, right? Like, they're specifically calling it
This
that.
in the 50s?
Yeah, in the early 50s. And so you see this like, And this is like, once again, outside the South, right? This idea that this
Yeah.
is being sold and marketed and this kind of consumer culture, right? Like you're going to get your battle
That,
flag.
that is happening even earlier. If
Mhm.
you look in the back of something called the Confederate Veteran Magazine,
Mhm.
there's tons of advertisement in the back, and they're selling things. They're selling Confederate battle flags. They're being made in New Jersey. They're selling, reproduction Confederate uniforms that are being made in Ohio. Books are being published in New York that are pro-Southern, pro-Confederate.
Mhm.
I mean, there's money to be made on this stuff, on the Confederacy, Confederate memory, and the lost cause, because the South didn't have the industry to do it yet.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think also the ways in which post-World War II, there is sort of a new language too for people who do want to oppose it to use. And fascism is part of that language, actually, right? So you have like the Black workers at some of these places, like Learners, for example, who are specifically saying like, would we be making swastikas, right? They're using that direct comparison. They're like, would we be allowed to make swastikas? Like they're saying like, you can't actually force us to make this flag, which is so offensive to so many of the Black workers working in this factory. You're asking us to reproduce this thing that's completely inoffensive. They had Black World War II vets who were also working in the factories, like saying this. And like I said, this is being produced, sold and produced, even not to the South, right? But at the same time, you're also having, at the same time in the Northern media, the idea that this is all fine, right? Like this is not like people waving these flags and wearing these things. It's not actually a big deal. Maybe not until we get to the 1960s where we see these people that are saying like waving these flags that are now these sort of anti-integrationist folks that are violently opposing this, that maybe people get the click of like, this isn't just like a thing. But I think you're right that the intimidation factor of the flag, because if you even look at a lot of imagery from the civil rights movement, right, what's in the background, right, of all these like anti-segregation like protests, like from Little Rock 9 to Meredith to all these people, it is the Confederate flag in the background. Like what is at the podium, right, when George Wallace is speaking, saying segregation now, segregation, but like it is the Confederate flag.
Yeah, when the Meredith march came through, this was 1966, and a group of them kind of branched off. They were going to go over to Meridian, and this guy is there was an organization for Americans for the Preservation of the White Race that had emerged in that time, and this guy says, he tells people, show up with your flags, but on the little antennas, like they had on cars back then, and bring that, because they wanted, they understood that he was just basically saying, this is how we intimidate these people by bringing out this symbol. I want us to talk about resistance more.
Absolutely.
Because I could talk about white assholes all day, but I don't want to. I think it's really important. I think one of the failures of my first book was I didn't talk about it enough, but I think that also, digitized newspapers have made a big difference in scholarship for a lot of us. And the fact that I had access to Black newspapers, and I could get a better sense of what that resistance looked like. And when I wrote No Common Ground, I had a chance to correct it a little bit. I'd like to talk about that. I'm not saying I've said everything, because I know I haven't. I wanted to write a book that I could put in people's hands, that students could read, that activists could read in their local communities, and know that it isn't just a white narrative about the monuments, that there is this other narrative that's really, really equally important in Southern communities. And that is the way in which Black Southerners responded and critiqued Confederate monuments. And I'll give you just a personal example. I have a neighbor who lives down the street from me, and she's from South Carolina. She's really old school. And she's like, nobody ever said anything about these monuments until about 5 years ago or something like that. It's like, this is the thing, because because they don't pay attention to what, the people of color in their community are saying about those things. And they absolutely have been. And it's like, you didn't have protests in the era of Jim Crow, because you could get killed for that. People could be lynched and, you know, and thrown in prison and all sorts of things. And so, but it wasn't, but it's also true that there was a critique going on in the Chicago Defender, you know this, you know, and because, and Black Southerners will say, yeah, this is like, you know, if these monuments didn't exist, people wouldn't want to practice hate against our people. This is in the 30s, early 30s. And so there is a long line of resistance that becomes more open after the Voting Rights Act. Right. And so it's not just the Meredith March, it's the fact that for the first time since Reconstruction, you finally see the election of Black officials at the local level. Eventually, you know, in the state level, but those local level politicians, those guys who make it on the city council or the county commission, begin questioning that. Why do we have a battle flag or a monument out in front of our government building? You know, and why are we subsidizing that? And so I think that's a really important, that moment is really important. And to have those people represent their communities and say out loud, you know, this is wrong.
Yeah, I mean, the idea that people just sort of woke up one day in like 2015 and decided to be angry about monuments or anything is just, you know, like it's kind of ridiculous. I mean, I think, you know, the idea just always was just stunning, you know, speaking of, you know, being a Southerner, growing up outside of Charleston, just walking around and seeing Confederate monuments constantly is just, you know, the Defenders of the Confederacy, you know, that one in Charleston, never mind the huge Calhoun, which is now down, overlooking the entire city of Charleston on top of that gigantic pedestal. And we're like, what in the world are we doing here, right? And yeah, from the time that many of these monuments went up, right, late 19th century, and we know, like, you know, there's editor Don Mitchell Jr. in Richmond Planet, who is just that big Monument Avenue, that's the huge monuments in Richmond. He is on them from the very first monument about how ridiculous it is to raise this huge monument to Robert E. Lee. And he was like, to put him on the same pedestal as like a George Washington or whoever. He says the founders of the nation. And he's talking about like how you see more Confederate flags and you see US flags waving. Like he's very like direct in his critiques, you know, in the 1890s and on, right? You see this in the Black press, of course, right? It's mostly in the Black press. And then we know there's vandalism of the monuments all throughout the South, you know, who vandalized them? Sometimes people were caught, but most of the time they weren't, right? So like it's vandalism of the monuments, you know, all throughout this time, you know, we know from like a lot of oral histories that people, you know, had this sort of vandalism of the monuments, like the idea that people were just kind of just sitting there and accepting the fact that these monuments existed. I think the direct confrontations you do see more starting in the civil rights movement, right? Over the monuments, their presence as people are sort of, you know, organizing in the South and, you know, seeing them in these very public spaces and these public squares and the courthouses, et cetera, being sort of very another sort of big representation, right, of like, of sort of the white supremacy of these places, what these monuments represent and what they're actually showing. In my own research, I talk about how like a lot of Black people like locally would try to challenge, like, you know, when some of these monuments went up, when we still had Black people remaining in power in the 1890s in like places like Virginia and North Carolina, the last gasps of Black political power in the South. And then like you make a really good point is that we do not see the next robust sort of big political challenges again until we do see Black political power return into the 70s, 80s, like, you know, 100 years later, when you start to see more sort of local politicians, people in Alabama and Georgia being like, why do we have this Confederate flag on our flag? You know, like, you know, why is this a thing that's on our flag? Or like, you know, questioning funding for certain, you know, things. You know, I talk about the 90s and how like, you know, Atlanta is trying to reframe themselves as the city, was it city too busy to hate? Was it that their thing? Yeah, city too busy to hate, right? And they're getting the Olympics, right? And so they're like, now all this attention is on Atlanta, like, oh, you have the Olympics, but then you have this Georgia flag that has the Confederate flag on it. So are you going to be selling this Georgia state flag along this international Olympics? You have these people from all over the world and they're going to be like, you know, buying this flag with it. So they don't actually end up having the state flag in a lot of the official Olympic stuff because it's that much of an embarrassment by the time that the Atlanta Olympics happened.
But when they redesign the flag, it's basically another type of Confederate flag.
Right.
It's the one that people don't recognize. That's
Right,
what I was saying,
exactly.
they don't recognize
They
it.
don't recognize it. But like, yeah, the way that, Atlanta's trying to market, it's also trying to market itself as a particular kind of Black city too, is the point I was going to make, right? So it wants to market itself in a particular kind of way. So then now we have to like have these sort of renegotiated conversations. But it gets, it's interesting because, growing up in the South, growing up in South Carolina, having went to high school in the 1990s, Confederate flag battles, I call them, right? So like, this is when the Confederate flag moves from atop of the State House. It was atop of the State House in South Carolina. It was placed there in 1961. Supposedly to celebrate the Civil War centennial, but it never came down. This is centennial, 1961, never came down until 2000, right? So we had all these battles over it, taking the flag down. The NAACP, they had their boycott over the flag. And we also had the battles in schools over people wearing Confederate flag apparel. So this is, a really heightened.
I thought it was interesting when I was researching this is that when, because what's prevented, this is related to this, I'm going to make sure, since 2015, but even before 2015, one of the things that's prevented monuments removal are monument laws, or they call them Heritage Protection Acts. South Carolina's was in 2000 when that flag came down, and they in the law, the way it's written, they make the Confederate battle flag a monument. It falls. That's what they put it into this law. But what was for me that was like, as someone who lives in North Carolina, that was so pernicious about it was that when after the AME Zion, the Mother Emanuel, church murders and that massacre, North Carolina was the first to pass a monument law to preserve monuments because they knew that monuments were next. These politicians in the South knew that, and so they began passing these laws or strengthening the laws. And so when monuments came out of down on Richmond, in Richmond on Monument Avenue, it was because there was a changing of the legislature. They changed the law in Virginia that returned local control and allowed them to remove the monuments there. Although the Lee Monument was owned by the state, so it ended up in a lawsuit, but it has come down. And this is the thing; it's so anti-Southern about the way people want to hold on to Confederate monuments. It's sort of local control has always been a thing in Southern history. It's like, it's like if there's states' rights and there's local rights, right? And so what more recent legislatures have done is say, no, you can't. If you're a local community, you can't do that. They're removing local control. So but when the law changed in Virginia, several places in Virginia, the law changed. That meant that those communities could take their monuments down. And in North Carolina is like has the second largest number of removals. But there is, because there's a loophole in our law that says if this monument is becomes the issue of public safety, in other words, it brings protesters and counter protesters and people get into fights and stuff, then that community can remove its monuments. But the laws are different in different states. And so when, the monuments came down in New Orleans, for example, I just have to remind people, it's like they might have come down in New Orleans, but they're firmly in place in the rest of Louisiana. So, yeah.
So I think for time's sake, I think it'd be a great moment to turn it, to open it up for questions. And I don't have a mic to bring around. So if you have a question, might stand up and use your outside voice. So, anybody want to start us off? Sure.
So, sorry, something that I'm really curious about, because at least when I was a teenager, this is all this was happening in Charleston. And a big argument that I heard was that we're erasing history by taking down monuments. And yeah, obviously, like, I've been learning that's like, there's so much to that, but assuming that that argument is made in good faith, what would be the best way to preserve that history that's educational, honest, and accessible to the public?
Great question. Thank you. Did everybody hear the question? Okay. Great.
I mean, that history, I wrote an entire book on Confederate monuments, on the history of Confederate monuments without ever going up and listening to what a Confederate monument had to say, because it doesn't say anything. And so, you know, it's like, you know, it's everywhere around if they want to look. It's in the local library, in their little local public library has a history room. There are photographs, there are, you know, postcards, there's speeches, there's all kinds of stuff that's available to people if they want to know the history of a monument in their community. It's not being erased. The way I look at it, it's like, no, if, first of all, let's just be clear, only about 100 something monuments have been removed, and there were over 800. So there's plenty out there. People want to, you know, go and see one. And I hate to hear that whole thing about erasing history, because like I'm a historian. I was like, you're not crying when like some developer comes in and mows down a black cemetery. You know, you're not, you know, like, where's your sense of history when that's happening? It's very, you know, very specific. But you know, it's not, Emily, it's just not erasing history. It's if one is removed, to me, it's like, no, we would be removing an artifact of Jim Crow. That's what you'd be removing. Now there's some history of that, but we can talk about that and read a book.
Ashley, did you want to ask them?
I mean, I agree. I'm also like very much not attached to monuments and in a more broad sense. So maybe I'm just like on the outside of a lot of that conversation in many ways. I think that, you know, people do get attached to them as sort of like these, you know, relics of the past, even though, and it's attached to their idea of their permanence. Like they have to be there permanently, right? Even though, you know, even traditionally, a lot of monuments have not been up permanently for whatever sense and purpose of time. Just because somebody put it up one day does not mean it needs to stay up. That's just, you know, my just very generic response to that.
The other thing is some of these monuments had been moved already, Confederate monuments, because they were put up before there were cars. Everybody had cars, and so they became traffic hazards. So some communities actually did move the monument. There was one in Gaston County, North Carolina, the worst. I think this is terrible because you know, if they really believe in history, you'd say, oh, leave it where it is, right? It was there next to the courthouse. They built a new courthouse, and in 1996, they moved the Confederate monument in front of the brand new courthouse.
Your questions or comments? Okay.
So there was a talk earlier today, and senator mentioned how sort of since the Unite the Right rally kind of feeding into January 6th, there's been a little bit of like an optics change in how it parts itself, specifically with respect to the use of the Confederate flag compared to other flags like the Blue Line or the Gadsden flag. And I was wondering, you kind of touched on this about newer movements are kind of using more underground symbols of the Confederacy. And I kind of wanted to ask, do you think that imagery is kind of getting substituted for something a little bit more low profile so what ways?
I don't know. I mean, probably the most, you know, widespread image from January 6th is a guy in the U.S. Capitol with a Confederate battle flag. So they're not hiding from that anymore. It's like the Klan doesn't bother to wear hoods anymore. They don't care, you know, and they're emboldened, and they have been emboldened. They were emboldened by the previous president, and they're emboldened by their state legislatures where, like where I live, you know, we're gerrymandered. And you have people who are in office who, you know, give people free passes about this kind of thing. I don't know. What do you think?
I mean, I think that there are definitely like a wider set of symbols that, you know, I'm always just enlightened, be like, oh, here's a new right-wing symbol I wasn't aware of that now I'm seeing that people are putting on their cars, et cetera. But I don't know that I'm seeing that the Confederate, you know, the battle flag as we know it has declined necessarily in use.
It's been modified.
Yeah, I think it's just been, it's been modified. And I think they still do see some sort of heritage in, you know, the Confederacy in some way. I mean, I think just thinking back a couple of years ago and seeing, you know, this, I think this was post Unite the Right also, and seeing that some sort of like, you know, some Canadian far right group using the Confederate flag. And I'm just like, okay, you're Canadian. What is going on? Like, how, you know, like, how are we, but this is the spread, right? Like we spread it out. And, you know, of course, when I was living in Ohio and seeing like these right-wing folks in Ohio, I mean, Ohio already had this huge Klan history too, but like seeing like, you know, a huge barn with Confederate battle flag, and then seeing people show up to these rallies with like Confederate flags, these like right-wing rallies already. So I don't know how much of the declining.
Well, what the, you know, in one of those images she showed this morning, was like the Confederate battle flag, but with the AK-47 on it.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mhm.
there are also the Confederate battle flag with, Donald Trump's image on it. I've seen as well. Yeah, I know. But you know, yeah.
Yeah, and this, sorry.
Yes, to build on that, I would be curious, if you could just talk a little bit more about how, right, the Confederate symbology and the mythology that goes about along with it, right? A lot of it, of course, focused on memory of the past, but how it relates to this kind of nascent, maybe nascent's not a strong word, but fascism in the US, right? Of kind of being used as a symbol for future visions, kind of along what I'm talking about, but more specifically around this Confederate symbology, how that plays within the Trumpist, MAGA, fascist.
Yeah, I mean, I'm fairly convinced, and I know this is like a huge debate among American historians / European historians. They love to about this. I'm fairly convinced, you know, of people, you know, like, you know, Nancy MacLean and others who have said that, you know, we can look at, you know, iterations of the Klan, first and second. Linda Gordon kind of says that she stopped short maybe of saying that, you know, the Klan is fascist, but she says there's elements of it that are fascistic, right? That if you look at the fact that it actually emerges in this post-Confederate moment specifically, right? And the symbolism that they use makes it that way. And the link between both the symbolism, the desire to like impose a type of authoritative government around sort of white nationalism, and that like, you know, maybe we don't see as much of like that and like sort of comparing it to like, you know, how we understand European fascism, but, you know, broadening our understanding of like how symbols and control over sort of narratives, you know, we talked about control over history and narratives is, I think there is a huge element of that. I think that the attachment to symbolism, I think the attachment to also, you know, that's part and parcel with this, I think, as well. The attachment to, you know, instituting a type of like top-down type of narrative around history as well. You know, I know, of course, we can think about that in the broader sense of how that's happening on the political level, right? But I think these people wanting to protect monuments and symbols in a certain version of history, a neo-Confederate version of history, to me also goes along with this as well. And I think that's why you see these broader groups that are so attached to the Confederacy, right? Like, and attached to like, you know, what are they not there to protect the Lee Monument, but they're also there to like think about why, like, why would these people want to take down the Lee Monument? They're against the people who want to take down the Lee Monument, right? That's what they're, you know, because they know that this represents taking it down, right? Represents a
Well,
type
you
of
think,
thing.
what about the chant, right? Well,
Mhm.
Jews will not replace us, but they don't, white These movements don't want to be replaced, right? And so I think that, you know, the Confederate battle flag, first of all, is about, you know, in its origins, is about, you know, taking a stance against government overreach, right? And I think that, you know, in their mind, right, this is what this is, you know, because the line that the war was over states' rights and federal government was infringing on states' rights. I mean, that's where, you know, it kind of begins. And I think it's still something about that a little bit, that's just about trying to prevent, you know, government overreach. These are people who had, you know, that flag represents the values of that there is, you know, we're trying to preserve something and preserve. I think about these guys, they're trying to preserve their, you know, white male patriarchy. I mean, I know women are involved in, and we heard about that earlier, but I mean, this is about, you know, preserving white control over everything and white male control over everything. I don't know.
No, and I think there's an element of like the kind of symbolism that is very attractive, because as neo-Confederacy is so embedded in like how they're very much attracted to symbols. And that then sort of like the broader elements of the movement, right? Like the first iteration of the Klan is made up mostly of former Confederates,
Yes.
right? And they're heavy into symbolism, the types of squad type violence that they're carrying out, like, you know, is really fascistic, right? The second iteration is, you know, some of them are like pretty directly connected to like, you know, brown shirt movements within the US, like they're in, you know, in a really direct way. They're not ex-Confederates, but they do still see, and they're much more national, but they do have that same kind of lineage. And I think now we have like the people who see their affinity with neo-Confederates, you know, still seeing themselves as sort of preserving something that Confederates and now neo-Confederates still want to preserve, right? Like there's some element they want to preserve, and that may be through history and symbolism, but all these things to me seem fairly interrelated.
And you ready for us to stop?
No.
I want
Like, are we about to
just
get
say
kicked out?
though that you know, I was working on a dissertation in the 90s on the UDC, and I noticed that, you know, the formation of the League of the South, which is formed in 1994. And somehow I got into an email exchange with the webmaster, but he called himself the Reb Master for the site for the League of the South. And
No.
I mean, if you read what, you know, the League of the South says it wants, they believed in secession still. They believed that they wanted to create a new Southern state in which there was a hierarchy. And of course, you know, who's at the top of that, like, you know, white men, you know. And so, they're anti-feminist, you know, anti-affirmative action, anti-LGBTQ, anti all this other stuff. It's got to be about straight white male patriarchy and control. So that's very different from what, you know, the Confederacy or those early Confederate organizations were about. This has expanded it into these other places.
I'm thinking of a line from Langston Hughes. They say that Hitler was a mighty bad man, but he learned his lessons from the Ku Klux.
Kind of did.
I think we have time for one or two more questions. So other people.
I was wondering, so I took a class with Dr. Cheryl Higashida about race relation and sound. And I was wondering if your approach to oral monuments like Dixie and even these songs like Sweet Home Alabama, like how your approach is different for that than like physical monuments.
Oh, that's a good question.
A song like Dixie.
Oh, I mean, well, one, we don't really hear Dixie that much anymore, right? We don't. I know, like, when I was in college, Ole Miss was still playing Dixie at many of their football games, but they were like one of the last holdovers, of course. I don't know, one of the last holdovers with still playing that song. I know in my own research, I knew that some of the battles post-integration in the South were over that song. I remember reading a particular story of a Black band member who was refusing to play Dixie and was kicked out of a band at an integrated high school in the South because he refused to play the song Dixie. He was like, no, I'm not playing the song Dixie. But that was still like, there was confrontations with the flag, there were confrontations with the mascot, the Rebels. Many, of course, high schools had the Rebels as their mascot. But playing the song Dixie in high school bands was a huge, huge confrontation. But I don't think we really get as much of that song particularly anymore. Though I will say the other day that when Arthur Ravenel died, he was, an elder statesman of South Carolina politics. He was a, old, Confederate defender, defended the Confederate flag, the bridge, the Cooper River Bridge, which I still call the Cooper River Bridge. I'm not calling the Arthur Ravenel Bridge. The Cooper River Bridge is named after him. And, he gets up at the funeral, they're giving all these eulogies. Glenn McConnell, who, used to own a Confederate memorabilia store, was also president of College of Charleston for a while. And if you Google him, there's many great pictures of him at this secession ball with, people dressed like enslaved people. So Glenn McConnell gives this eulogy and he's just like, oh, Arthur Ravenel just had this disagreement, he was this, guy. And then at the end of this really pretty write-up about Ravenel's funeral, they're like, and Dixie was playing as his recessional. And I was like, wow, this thinking at the time that I had not heard people even talking about Dixie in a while. But yeah, it was played at this man's funeral as recessional, long time, South Carolina politician. But it was just played as a sort of normal thing because we have this folksy, South Carolinians allegedly had this folksy love of this old politician, and no one was really examining how crazy it was to just have this man's funeral write-up and the fact that he was just going out with the song Dixie playing. I don't know, but
I would like to just point your attention to Southern rock bands, like Leonard Skinner, who I don't know, in the last decade, when they took the Confederate battle flag down off behind that would often appear behind them on stage, their fans were irate about it. But there's also, this band Pantera, this rock, there are bands out there that are performing I would call these sort of pro-Confederate, pro-Southern songs in their repertoire that, have a following. And they use Confederate symbols in their stage shows. And it's interesting because it's people aren't really protesting that. They're actually attending those things. But you're right, Dixie is really not getting play. I think another place in where you see, Confederate symbols and memory being passed along is in the Kappa Alpha fraternities that are on the campuses of Southern universities. You'll see stuff like that. Although they've had to be a little bit quieter about their mess.
They've had a lot of come to whatever moments on a bunch of campuses.
Yeah.
But also you speak of the music, but Dixie Chicks became the Chicks.
Yeah.
Right?
That was their
change. Lady Antebellum, there was a huge fight over that,
Yeah.
but they became Lady A, but then it came out that they stole that name from a Black singer. People were now we've kind of countered the point of maybe changing your name.
Well, I think I'll take the right of the last question as the organizer. You're thinking a lot, I'm listening to you all, and I'm thinking a lot about the power of the system, right? And I think that one of the things that maybe we collectively want to think about is how to kind of use that power as well to our own purposes. And I wondered if you have historical examples of resistance movements, Black resistance movements, other resistance movements who have mobilized an image or a symbol or some kind of work of visual culture as a counter image to the Confederate.
Oh, there have been so many attempts, I think, by Black Southerners, I think some very ill-fated, to try to either counter or co-opt. When I said the 90s battles of the flag, actually part of that was because people in the 90s, early 90s, if the younger students probably don't remember, but when the film Malcolm X became really popular, so did people wearing shirts that had X on them, right? It became a fashion statement. but that like apparently offended quite a few people. And so then we get like all these campaigns that then also ban clothing that had Malcolm X like symbolism on it. Because they're like, oh, we can't wear the Confederate flag. We also can't have people wear clothing that has Malcolm X because those are the same things in people's minds, right? And so like there were these sort of ill-fated attempts to be like, oh, you know, and like, you know, I think John Koski writes about this in his book about Confederate battle flag, where he talks about like the "you wear your X, I wear mine" campaign. You know, of course, like Malcolm X being like big proponent of like, you know, Black Power, et cetera, and like, you know, those kinds of symbolism. But that was a very, to me, a very 1990s moment. See, yeah. No. Mine does look great. But yeah, it was a very. Normally. Okay. No, I was going to say quickly, it was a very 1990s moment. I think instead, I think we have like these moments of protest in the more recent years that like, you know, Bree Newsom getting up and snatching down the flag, you know, in South Carolina became a really like big imagery. I think for me, even more localized in Charleston, I think he later passed away, but there was a Black activist at a rally that snatched a flag and just started running with it. I like, someone turned into a gift for me that I thought was really funny. Like you just start snatching, you just running down the street in Charleston, this Confederate flag from these like groups of like these counter protesters. I think most of the counter symbolism now has been very like Black Lives Matter centered, which I didn't really get a chance to say, but I think there is no movement to take down monuments without Black Lives Matter. None. There is no movement because that movement is happening at the same time. That's why you get that in the George Floyd moment. You get the young people who are on the ground, who are organized, et cetera, that those movements don't happen without the other. So I think a lot of the symbolism that we see at the time is very much the symbolism that has come out of that movement. You know, the counter imagery, the Lee's pedestal imagery that's become so prolific. Yeah, the projections on the, you know, the empty Lee pedestal, I think that's a really powerful image too. So, you know, that has come out of Black Lives Matter movement. So, yeah.
Image makers.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you so much. This is a beautiful turnout and a fantastic conversation. And I think we all really applaud. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Oh, goodness. I know.
Ask you about depoliticized images of the flag. Like, you know, we talk about that with Germany and so I just remember growing up in Denver, outside the South.
Yeah.
General Lee